Educating our children and housing our people are two of the most pressing problems in our city today. Over the past 40 years, no one has worked harder at solving these problems than our next speaker. He has been an advisor to several governors and mayors, including Mayor Wagner. It is indeed my pleasure to introduce Julius Edelstein, Senior Vice Chancellor Emeritus of the City University of New York.
Today, we hail and salute the first federal Public Housing Act, authored and championed by the late Senator Wagner and the late Congressman Stegall. Public housing is one of those thorny but succulent, hardy but utilitarian, magnificent but problem-laden accomplishments of Roosevelt's New Deal, but also of Truman's Fair Deal, of Kennedy's New Frontiers, and of Johnson's Great Society. All these presidents contributed to public housing, but none did enough for it. Public housing has been the object of much cruel criticism, much of it unwarranted, as the chairman made clear. Some public housing is pretty bad. Some of it has been and is being torn down. But most of it is most useful and absolutely essential. There should be much, much more of it. What some public housing critics would really like is for all poor people to be silent and invisible and not to constitute a public eyesore. That is why the homeless out on the streets and in other public places are so offensive to middle-class sensibilities. There is also the American myth that the problem of housing for the poor can best be handled in the same way as housing for the rich. In other words, by private enterprise. But that has never worked anywhere in the world, resulting in more slums for the poor and eventually homelessness. Public leadership, public funds, and public credit are essential elements of programs for the production of housing for the poor. Private enterprise can play a part, in some cases a major part, but the provision of housing for the poor is and always has been a public responsibility. The available supply of private housing for the poor will always be a social disaster. As far back as the 1940s, the great conservative, Senator Robert A. Taft, said, "Private development and perfectly free enterprise in the United States has never eliminated the slums, and I see no reason to think that they ever will. They simply cannot reach the lowest income group." Quite a few years ago, a good friend of mine who has since departed, Charles Abrams, wrote an authoritative book about housing. It began with the following paragraph. "The Great Depression of the 1930s spawned legislation that changed forever the federal government's role in many facets of society, and housing is no exception. In the United States Housing Act of 1936 was one of those landmark pieces of legislation. It established for the first time a program of publicly financed, publicly owned housing for low-income families. The genius of the Public Housing Act of 1937 consisted of its provisions for cooperative action by both the federal and local governments in authorizing the establishment of a somewhat autonomous board of authority which could use both federal and local and state resources, including bonding authority, to build subsidized low-rent housing. In New York City, between 1950 and 1970, 150,000 units of public housing were constructed, of which 70,000 were federally funded and 80,000 were funded with state and local funds. These 150,000 units could and did provide housing for families consisting of 600,000 individuals, which is equivalent to the population of the city of Cleveland, Ohio. Was this enough to meet the need? No, not by far. The enactment of the Housing Act of '37 represented really the high watermark of the New Deal. Beginning in 1938, a tide of political conservatism began to flow. The main thrust of housing legislation in the post-Roosevelt years down to the present has been to induce and encourage the involvement of the private sector, of the banks and mortgage houses and moneylenders in the production of housing. These enterprises, backed by federal guarantees, working with real estate promoters and developers, helped create the nation's suburbs and the Sun Belt, from Florida to Arizona to California, populating them and housing them, leaving the northern, eastern, and midwestern center city areas to serve as refugee camps for the poor. There became available in the cities, the largely worn-out housing abandoned by the upper mobile young and the middle-class families who moved to suburbia and exurbia, and many to the Sun Belt. A substantial amount of federally aided and state-aided middle-income housing has been built in the cities, but it has proved to be too costly for most of the lower middle class and certainly for the poor. That is just about how the federal housing policy functioned through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and the 1980s. One resident of a New York slum testifying before a community hearing on the Model Cities program, remember that word? When that program was first projected about 20 years ago, summed it up as follows, addressing herself to a representative of the federal government. First, you tried to urban renew us. Then you tried to wage a war on poverty for us. Now you say you want to put model cities on us. Now, I don't know about anything except about cooking, but I know you can't bake, broil, and fry a fish all at the same time. If there is one criterion, above all others, by which one can distinguish a virtuous and a just society, it is the manner in which the poor are treated and the extent of the ongoing effort to provide and achieve social justice. The availability and sufficiency of housing for the poor is one of the hallmarks of social decency. Our nation's program of public housing is a major feature of our national levels of social justice. Those levels are certainly not high enough. In most respects, they are disgraceful, and we can and ought to feel ashamed. Public housing is costly. By its nature, it cannot be self-liquidating or self-supporting, but it is critical, and it ought to be one of our highest priorities. Therefore, this exhibit here at LaGuardia Community College and today's observance of the 50th anniversary of the Housing Act of '37 cannot be too highly praised, saluted, and reflected upon. Last Thursday was Thanksgiving Day. In 1932, the then President-elect Franklin D. Roosevelt issued a Thanksgiving statement which concluded with the words of an ancient prayer. Remember in pity such as this day are destitute, homeless, or forgotten of their fellow men. The phrase, welfare of the forgotten man, became one of the main themes of the New Deal. If only we could recall and refresh that theme today.